Have you ever looked at your own life and thought, why do I still feel empty? You've got the career, the travels, the followers, the picture-perfect apartment with morning light that makes your coffee look divine. Everyone thinks you've made it, and yet, when the noise dies down and the phone goes dark, there's a silence that won't leave you alone. A strange void that success can't touch. You're not broken. You're being called. Because that ache inside you, it isn't failure. It's your soul whispering that something eternal is missing. You were created for more than likes, goals, and weekend getaways. You were created for presence, for Christ. And when everything else fades, that quiet presence is the only thing that can hold you together. In today's video, we're going to walk through the story of a woman who had everything the world could offer: beauty, freedom, money, attention. And yet, she carried the same difficulties, the same invisible overburden. The same question you might be asking right now: why do I feel so far from peace? What she discovered will change how you see your own life, your family, your heart, and maybe even your destiny. So stay until the end, because what begins as a story of emptiness becomes a story of redemption. You'll see how the very silence you've been running from might be the place where God is waiting for you. And I promise, by the end of this video, you'll understand why the life you thought was falling apart might actually be falling into place.
She had what most people would call success, the kind that sparkles under the California sun. Her apartment was filled with soft light, her mornings with the hum of ambition. On the surface, everything looked perfect, but deep down there was an ache she couldn't name, a quiet emptiness that lingered even after the laughter faded. It wasn't sadness exactly, just a sense that something essential was missing. That's often how it begins for many women: the invisible difficulties of womanhood, the silent weight of having everything yet feeling nothing. She didn't realize it then, but this very void was the whisper of grace calling her back to what truly matters. Every day she woke up chasing one more thing: a promotion, a compliment, a spark of attention, believing that success would silence the restlessness inside her. But each night, as she stared at the ceiling in the quiet glow of her phone, she felt that same overburdened heart pulsing against the silence. The world had promised her fulfillment if she just worked harder, loved stronger, looked better. Yet nothing filled the space that only Christ could fill. That's the paradox of modern life. We drown in abundance, yet thirst for meaning. And in that thirst, without realizing it, her soul began to pray. She often thought about her family, though she didn't call as much anymore. The distance wasn't just miles, it was spiritual. She remembered her mother's prayers, the way her father's laughter used to fill the house, the sound of Sunday hymns in the background. But that world felt far away now, almost unreal. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul? Mark 8:36. The verse came to her one night out of nowhere. She didn't know why it surfaced. Maybe something divine was stirring beneath the noise, quietly reminding her that the soul can't live on achievements alone. She tried to silence that feeling, of course. She filled her weekends with parties, her evenings with streaming shows, her mornings with coffee and goals. That's what the world tells women to do: to keep moving, keep shining, never stop. But the truth is, the stillness always catches up. It waits for you between breaths, in that fragile second before sleep, when you realize that your carefully curated life still feels empty. The difficulties of womanhood aren't just external. They live inside, in the unspoken questions, the longing for connection, the fatigue of pretending. That morning, as sunlight filtered through her curtains, something shifted, subtle, like a quiet nudge from heaven. No voice, no vision, just awareness. Maybe, she thought, this ache isn't punishment. Maybe it's invitation. Perhaps the life of a woman isn't measured by her accomplishments, but by the quiet courage to listen to the soul beneath them. And though she didn't yet have the words or the faith, she took her first step toward something deeper, something that would one day bring her home to Christ. The city lights flickered across the Uber window as she leaned her head back, watching the blur of neon and night. It had been another long day, Meetings, deadlines, fake smiles, the usual chaos. The driver hummed softly to the radio, but her mind drifted somewhere else, somewhere quieter. She remembered being a little girl in the backseat of her mother's car, watching the same lights pass by. Only back then they seemed magical. Her mom would sing hymns softly. Be still and know that I am God, Psalm 46:10, and the world felt safe. Funny how adulthood makes you forget those moments when faith came naturally, before the difficulties of womanhood clouded everything with noise and pressure. As the car turned onto a long stretch of freeway, she felt that old ache again, the void she'd been trying to outrun. For years she thought she could fill it with success, with people, with distractions. But it kept following her like a shadow. The rhythm of the tires on the asphalt felt almost like a prayer, steady and unrelenting. And somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, she realized how far she'd drifted, not just from her family, but from herself, from Christ. She whispered a small thought that wasn't quite a prayer, but close enough. If you're still there, I don't even know how to find you anymore. It's strange how grace works. Sometimes it comes when you least deserve it. In that car, under the hum of the engine, she felt a sudden stillness. Not peace exactly, but awareness. The kind that comes before transformation. She thought about her mother's face when she used to kneel to pray, about how faith wasn't just words or rituals. It was breath. The life of a woman wasn't meant to be lived disconnected from the soul. It was meant to be a dialogue between heaven and earth. She remembered a verse from her childhood catechism. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. James 4:8. Maybe that's all she needed to do. Just turn her face back toward the light. The car hit a red light, and for the first time in months, she didn't grab her phone. She just stared out the window at a small church glowing faintly at the corner of the street. Nothing fancy, just a simple white building with a cross barely lit. Something about it stirred her. She remembered how she used to trace little crosses on her wrist as a girl whenever she was afraid. That gesture came back to her instinctively, and she did it again, quietly, shyly, as if testing whether she still remembered how. In that fragile motion, the overburdened walls around her heart began to crack. When the car finally pulled up to her apartment, she sat there for a moment, not wanting to move. The driver said softly, "You okay, miss?" She smiled faintly. "Yeah, I think so." It wasn't true, but it was the first time she'd said it without pretending. She wasn't okay yet, but she was waking up. That's how spiritual redemption begins. Not in grand gestures, but in small awakenings. And as she stepped out of the car, she carried that strange new quiet with her. A silence that felt less like emptiness and more like the beginning of hope. When she unlocked the door, the apartment felt colder than usual. The air was still, almost heavy, as though the walls themselves remembered how long she'd been gone, not just physically, but spiritually. She dropped her bag on the couch, kicked off her heels, and stood there in the quiet. Sometimes silence doesn't comfort. It exposes. The emptiness of that room mirrored the void inside her. The same ache that had followed her through every achievement, every success she once celebrated. For all the glamour of her city life, this moment felt raw, stripped down to truth. She was lonely, exhausted, and deeply overburdened. Her phone buzzed. Another Tinder message. Another invitation to meaningless company. She sighed. It wasn't that she was against love. She just couldn't bear the hollow noise of conversations that led nowhere. Every time she scrolled through faces, she wondered if this was what modern love had become. Connection without communion, presence without depth. The difficulties of womanhood aren't just the expectations placed on her by others. They're the quiet betrayals she makes against her own soul. She thought of her family again, of the laughter she'd traded for comfort, of the Sunday dinners she hadn't attended in years. Better a dinner of herbs where love is, she remembered from Proverbs 15:17, than a fattened ox and hatred with it. She walked into the kitchen, opened a bottle of wine, and stared at her reflection in the glass door. It wasn't vanity, it was longing. She missed herself, the girl who used to sing, who used to pray, who believed Christ could hear even the smallest sigh. The world had told her to be strong, independent, unstoppable. But what no one told her was that strength without softness turns into armor, and armor keeps love out. She wasn't weak. She was weary, and maybe that was okay. Even Christ grew tired, even he wept. Maybe the life of a woman didn't have to be flawless to be holy. She curled up on the couch, the soft hum of the city in the distance. Her thoughts wandered to her friends, the ones always smiling on Instagram but breaking in private. It struck her that most of them, like her, were suffering in silence, afraid to admit their difficulties, afraid to say, "I'm not okay." That fear is what keeps redemption out. Because God doesn't heal what we hide. The truth hurts, but it also frees. She whispered softly, "Lord, I'm tired." It wasn't poetic, but it was real, and heaven always listens to real. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, she didn't want to plan her way out of pain. She wanted to feel it, to face it, to let Christ walk through it with her. Maybe this ache wasn't the end. Maybe it was the door. The saints said that grace often begins where comfort ends. She didn't have their faith yet, but she had a flicker, a spark that whispered, "You're not forgotten." And as she drifted to sleep, that whisper followed her like a small light in a dark room, promising that family, forgiveness, and faith weren't lost, just waiting to be found again. The next morning, sunlight spilled through her blinds and onto the wooden floor like a quiet invitation. She moved slowly, her body heavy from the night's thoughts, her mind wandering in that soft fog between sleep and memory. She wasn't sure why, but she felt drawn to clean. Maybe it was instinct, maybe grace disguised as impulse. As she opened an old drawer, searching for nothing in particular, her hand brushed against something covered in dust. It was small, leather-bound, the corners worn from use. She recognized it instantly, her mother's book of prayers, the one she used to carry everywhere. The sight of it made her heart stutter, as if family, faith, and forgotten promises had suddenly come rushing back. She sat on the floor and turned the fragile pages. They smelled like childhood, like candle wax, old wood, and Sunday mornings. Between the lines she saw her mother's handwriting, little notes, verses, even stains from tears long dried. "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit." Psalm 34:18. She traced the words with her fingers, almost afraid they might disappear. For the first time in years, she felt something holy stir inside her. Not guilt, not fear, but longing. That old void wasn't empty after all. It was space waiting to be filled. She didn't know the term for it, but deep inside, her soul had begun to move toward stillness, a kind of interior prayer that had no sound but spoke louder than words. She smiled faintly, remembering how her mother used to whisper those same prayers when she was too anxious to sleep. "When you can't find words," she'd say, "just breathe his name." She tried it now. Christ. The word felt foreign on her lips and yet familiar, like coming home to a language she'd forgotten she spoke. The moment was simple, almost fragile, but it cracked something open in her. She didn't suddenly become devout or enlightened, but she felt her difficulties, her overburdened heart, her small hopes, and her quiet hunger for redemption. And she brought them, awkwardly, honestly, to God, for years. She had been chasing success, believing it could drown out the loneliness. But here, holding a book that cost nothing, she found more peace than any luxury had ever given her. This wasn't the loud kind of spirituality that posts quotes online and calls it faith. This was stillness, humility, presence, the kind that strips you of pretense and leaves you face to face with yourself. The life of a woman, she realized, isn't about keeping everything together. It's about knowing where to fall when it all comes apart, and she was finally learning to fall into something eternal. She closed the book gently, holding it to her chest. It was more than paper. It was memory, lineage, family. It was her mother's faith calling out through time, telling her that no matter how far she'd wandered, Christ had never stopped walking beside her. She wiped a tear and laughed softly to herself. Maybe prayer didn't always change circumstances. Maybe it changed people. And maybe that was the point all along. She looked toward her shelf, where an old wooden cross stood, half hidden by books. For the first time in years, she didn't look away. It started as a simple impulse, to clean the closet, to make space, to put her life in order. But we both know that when the soul begins to heal, it often leads us straight into the things we've buried. She found the old chest tucked away beneath folded blankets, one she hadn't opened since she moved out years ago. Its hinges creaked as though time itself sighed when she lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, postcards, letters from her family, fragments of another life, one filled with laughter, innocence, and faith. She felt her breath catch. These weren't just memories. They were mirrors, reflecting who she used to be before the world convinced her to become someone else. She picked up a picture. Her. As a child, barefoot in the fields of Iowa, sunlight tangled in her hair, her father smiling in the background. The simplicity of that moment hit her harder than any sermon could. Back then, life was small but whole. They didn't talk much about success or image. They talked about kindness, about being good, about Christ. She remembered kneeling beside her grandmother, who prayed without fancy words, whispering, "Lord, thank you for today." That was enough. Somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten how to be grateful for the small things. The scent of rain, the sound of her mother's voice, the rhythm of shared meals. The void inside her wasn't punishment. It was the absence of gratitude. Tears blurred her vision as she flipped through the photos. Birthdays, holidays, faces of people who'd loved her without conditions. She had run so far chasing success that she'd left behind the very soil that had nourished her. That's the tragedy of modern life. We trade roots for wings and then wonder why we feel lost. The life of a woman in this century often means being everything to everyone. Strong, beautiful, unstoppable. Yet nobody teaches her how to be still, how to weep, how to receive. Even Christ wept at the tomb of his friend. That tenderness wasn't weakness. It was truth. And truth, she realized, is where healing begins. She found an old letter from her mother, creased, yellowed, written in that familiar looping script. "My dear girl," it began, "don't ever forget that Christ doesn't live in perfection, but in presence." Her mother had written that when she first moved away, when ambition burned brighter than peace. Now those words struck her like prophecy. She whispered them aloud, as if reading a prayer. Not in perfection, but in presence. And in that whisper, she felt the overburdened armor she'd built around her heart begin to soften. She placed the photos and letters carefully back into the chest, but not before holding one last image close, her mother lighting a candle at church, eyes closed, face peaceful. For the first time, she understood what that peace meant. It wasn't the absence of difficulties. It was trust in the midst of them. It was the kind of quiet strength that only comes from knowing you're not alone. And as she closed the chest, she realized that maybe the memories weren't just reminders of what was lost. They were invitations to return. That night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something sacred had been quietly unfolding all along. The apartment, once heavy with silence, now seemed softer, almost alive. She took her mother's old book of prayers and set it gently on the table. The city lights glimmered through the window, but for once she didn't feel drawn to them. She lit a small candle, not out of ritual, but remembrance. The flame flickered, steady but humble, like her faith, fragile, yet real. She knelt down, awkwardly at first, the way someone might kneel after years of forgetting how. The weight of difficulties, of overburdened dreams, of unspoken guilt, pressed on her shoulders. And still she whispered, "Lord, I don't know where to start." The words came slow, halting, but true. There was no pretense now, no mask of success, no curated confidence. Just her, small, tired, human. "Be still and know that I am God," Psalm 46:10 echoed in her memory. So she was still. For the first time in years, she didn't try to fix herself. She just breathed. And in that silence, she felt something she hadn't felt in forever. Presence. Not an emotion, not a vision, but a quiet certainty that Christ had never left her. The void that once terrified her was now full of warmth. It wasn't empty space. It was grace. She prayed for her family, for the people she'd hurt, for the girl she used to be. Her words weren't polished, but they were alive. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not giving up on me." Tears ran freely, but they weren't of despair. They were the kind that wash the heart clean. She realized redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about allowing Christ to enter it. All the difficulties of womanhood she'd carried, the loneliness, the comparisons, the guilt, began to look different now. They hadn't broken her. They'd brought her to this moment of truth. In the quiet that followed, she understood something she'd missed her whole life. Prayer isn't about being strong. It's about being seen. It's about letting God meet you where you are, even in your failures, even in your mess. The saints had known this. They called it stillness of the heart. She didn't know those ancient words, but she was living their meaning. Her spirituality was no longer about rules or appearances. It was about relationship. A woman on her knees, finally at peace with her fragility, finding Christ in her own weakness. As she blew out the candle, the smoke curled upward like a final amen. The apartment was dark again, but it no longer felt empty. She sat for a moment, her hands folded, eyes closed. Somewhere deep inside she felt it, that small, steady voice she'd been chasing for years. You were never alone. She smiled through the tears. Life would still have its difficulties, its overburdened days, its endless noise. But now she knew where to return when the silence called. And that was enough.